Good morning and welcome to Tulane University. It is my pleasure to introduce our next session, the Energy Transition in Latin America. If time allows, at the end of this session, the panel will take questions submitted by the audience. To submit a question, please scan the QR code located on the screens around the room. And please be sure to silence your cell phones. Enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our moderator, Dean Paulo Goiz of the A.B. Freeman School of Business at Tulane University.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here talking about the future of energy in Latin America. I guess I was qualified to be the moderator because people realize I'm from Brazil and I probably know something about energy. But it is my pleasure to be here with our great panelists. I'm going to introduce each one of them, and then I'll ask them to make some opening statements. I'll ask some questions, and then we will open up for questions from the audience. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Ludovico Feoli. He is the director of the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research and the research associate professor in the Stone Center for Latin American Studies and the Department of Political Science at Tulane University. His research interests include the political economy of market reforms in Latin America, institutions, institutional change, and the quality of governance. The second speaker comes from Houston, from Rice University. Francisco Monaldi is director of the Latin America Energy Program at Rice, the Baker Institute for Public Policy. He is the director of the Latin America Energy Program and a fellow at the Center of Energy Studies at Rice University. He is also a lecturer at Rice's Economic Department and Jones Graduate School of Business, a non-resident fellow at Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, and a member of the International Faculty at IESA School of Management in Venezuela. He has held visiting academic positions at Stanford, at Harvard Kennedy School, Tufts Fletcher School, Tecnológico de Monterrey, and Universidad de los Andes. He has conducted several government, multilateral agencies, and corporations, and authored numerous academic publications on the political economy of energy policy. The third speaker is Matheus Chagas. He's the Vice President of New Market Growth of Grand Isle Shipyard, GIS, a leader in providing solutions in the power, energy, and infrastructure sectors. With over 8 years of experience in renewable energy, he spearheaded the development of the first Jones Act compliant service vessel for Ørsted in the US while leading SOES's renewable energy department globally. He holds a degree in economics and political science from the University of Texas at Austin, and is a recognized expert in Latin America's renewable energy markets. So we have a combination of academics, thought leaders, practitioners who are actually doing the work and providing services to the renewable industry in Latin America. So I would like to spend the next maybe 3 minutes setting up the stage. Latin America is very important for Tulane. We this year are celebrating 100 years of the Latin American Studies program. That led to the Stone Center. Tom is the director, been the director for a long time, and traditionally have been very tied to Latin America through our academic programs. Latin America is also very important to the state of Louisiana, to the Gulf region, traditionally, historically, all the commerce that took place, commodities, agricultural products, immigration that took place. So Latin America is not a monolithic region. It consists of 33 different countries. And when you think about the future of energy, what each country is doing is trying to find that right balance between what we call energy security, making sure that we have the energy sources that are going to generate power for the industrial base, for transportation, for electricity, and balance that against the issues related to climate and decarbonization. And each country, as you're going to see from the panel, we're going to talk about a few of them, they are at different points in that continuum. Things change a lot because Latin America is a vast region. The countries, they can differ a lot due to its geology, geography, climate, the level of development, society, the political environment. So those are all factors that are going to define where those countries are in that continuum. So I hope that this panel is going to shed light into what's going on, and specifically the importance of what's going on in Latin America to the US, to Louisiana, to the industry here, to our future of energy as we move forward. So I'd like to first ask Ludovico to give his 5-minute kind of summary of how he sees the situation of energy in Latin America.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you, all of you. Good morning. I believe Latin America is well positioned to contribute to and to benefit from a transition to renewables. It's rich in fossil fuels, it's rich in renewable sources, it's rich in critical minerals and materials, and it's positioned to be essentially a global clean energy powerhouse if it can manage to overcome governance, regulatory, and social obstacles. Its energy matrix is already cleaner than the rest of the world. About 60% of its electricity generation comes from renewables, mostly hydro and geothermal. This represents a huge source of flexibility as solar and wind grow, as they're expected to. The share of biofuels in road transport is twice the global average, and that's mostly thanks to Brazil. And the region represented 5% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions since 1971, 5%, while representing 9% of global GDP over the same period, which would indicate that it's relatively decoupled from fossil fuels. The energy sector presents economic growth opportunities for the region. Lamentably, the region is emerging from yet another lost decade, which is perhaps worse than the first one, which was back in the 1980s. After the end of the last commodity super cycle, global demand for critical minerals and metals is expected to increase 5-fold by 2040 in a net zero scenario, creating what some people refer to as an extractive imperative. Lithium demand is expected to grow by over 20% annually and go from about 500,000 metric tons in 2021 to 4 million tons in 2030. Critical minerals are more geographically concentrated than oil or natural gas, something that very few people realize. And Latin America will benefit from this fact. It will be a source of international clout, especially if coupled with value-added processing. So the region has a third or more of the global reserves for lithium, copper, and silver. Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia hold roughly 60% of the globe's lithium reserves. Chile and Argentina currently produce some 35% of the world's lithium, an amount that is set to rise due to the ongoing project expansions that exist in Chile, new projects that are starting in Argentina, and perhaps Bolivia will come online at some point as well. The region produces 18% of the world's gold, over 50% of its silver, and 45% of its copper. So you can see how relevant it is in that respect. But investment would need a major boost to reach the necessary production. And attracting private capital will be critical. But political and regulatory instability is a threat. Resource nationalism is well established. Lithium is considered a strategic resource and is reserved for the state in Chile and Bolivia, although public-private partnerships will be indispensable and are expected. because the region has been exposed to extractive industries historically, there's a good deal of social mobilization against extraction. The Environmental Justice Atlas has documented up to 500 conflicts related to mineral extraction. Over half of them have been in Latin America. And what seems to be endemic economic instability, Argentina comes to mind, and high financing costs are barriers to investment. Also, political instability. We have a disruptive regime in Argentina, repeated attempts at constitutional reform in Chile, electoral uncertainty in Bolivia, all hubs of critical mineral extraction, and a lack of definition in the rules of the game for lithium. So the obstacles to overcome are substantial, but the potential is enormous. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ludovico. Francisco?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will try to build on what Paulo and Ludovico have said. I think it's important to stress that Latin America's energy transition will be very different than the transition elsewhere, because our energy matrix, as was mentioned, is so different, and decarbonization policies therefore have to be tailored to these realities. Not only, as Ludovico mentioned, we generate much less carbon in terms of our GDP that the region had, but the composition of the carbon emission is very different. Whereas in the world, 74% of the emissions comes from the energy sector, in Latin America, only 43% of the emissions generated by the region come from the energy sector. In contrast, land and agriculture generate about 45% in Latin America and only 14% globally. So a lot of the world discussion on how to proceed with the energy transition and decarbonization are designed for either the sort of the global stage or designed in developed countries that have a very different reality from Latin America. A big part of the reason why Latin America is different was mentioned by Ludovico, is the fact that renewable power is about 38% globally, but it's more than 60% in Latin America, even more so in South America, which is about 70%, because in the Caribbean is very little, for example, if you include that, and in Central America and Mexico is more 30 to 40%. There are countries like Paraguay that are 100% hydro. There are other countries like Costa Rica and Uruguay that have a completely renewable matrix. So in that sense, some of these smaller countries are completely advanced in their transition. Having said that, the region is highly heterogeneous, as Paulo mentioned. So there are going to be winners and losers in the energy transition, and there are going to be very different transitions, as I mentioned. Again, Caribbean, mostly hydrocarbons used to produce electricity. They need to significantly change that. There are countries that are posed to be really significant winners of the energy transition. For example, Chile comes to mind as, imagine this country has some of the largest mineral reserves, critical mineral reserves in the world. They have some of the best solar and wind potential on Earth. Unfortunately for them, as you know, Chile is a very long country, and the best solar is very much up in the north. The very best wind is in the other extreme of the country, and the population is not in either. But having said that, the potential for Chile in the energy transition is amazing. Also because they import all their hydrocarbons, so they actually have tremendous incentives to move fast in the energy transition. But there are other countries in the region that are heavily dependent on hydrocarbon exports, and that includes Venezuela, Trinidad, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and to some extent Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, even though they are not dependent on oil and gas. the oil and gas industry is a pretty significant actor in their economies and represents the largest companies in each of those countries. I also wanted to mention that Latin America has some areas in which it will be a very important actor in the world, in the global energy transition, not in their own transition, but in the global one. And the first one is, of course, supplier of critical minerals. If Latin America doesn't significantly increase the production of copper, lithium, and other minerals, there is simply not going to be an energy transition as fast as we need it to happen. And there, the challenges that Ludovico mentioned about social, environmental issues related to the activity and the obstacles to that are, things that have to be managed well. Of course, Latin America could be it is a big carbon sink, all the Amazon, but it's also in danger of deforestation is a big danger. So Latin America has a lot to do with land management and preservation of forests and the like. It has also to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. The region has, on average, between 1% and 2% of the GDP of the region is devoted to subsidize the consumption of fossil fuels, which, of course, should be the opposite. Another big problem in some countries is flaring and venting of natural gas. The Venezuela and Mexico in particular are among the worst offenders in the world, so we have to fix that. And finally, I wanted to mention something that Ludovico said about the politics, the economics, and the institutions of the region. The region has been facing a tough economic time, and so it's hard for governments to, more than the rhetoric, to actually put a lot of money on the energy transition or to tax their citizens and the like. But more than that, one of the biggest challenges of the region and one of the heterogeneous elements of the region is the institutional quality. For the energy transition, you actually need pretty high quality institutions. Think about this. You need it's easy to produce oil because it's a high rent, a high risk type of activity that exports all and gets dollars. But to have a profitable renewable sector, you actually need good regulations, credibility, good rule of law. You need low cost of capital. All these things require high quality institutions, long-term stability of public policy. And so I think the point that Ludovico made is super important. So unfortunately, that would mean that some countries like Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Costa Rica might advance in their energy transition relatively far, but other countries will lag significantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Matheus?
Yes, thank you. I'll try to follow our fellow panelists here with the amount of data that they provided already. So, as they said, Latin America is crucial for the energy transition. Its diversity, it's been blessed with vast wind, solar, bioenergy, and so the diversification of the energy matrix is already pretty significant. Yet, we rely heavily on fossil fuels to operate in country and in the countries in Latin America. All the equipment, all the machinery, all the industry still runs heavily on fossil fuels. Therefore, as we reach the energy transition, we're starting to see new renewable energy to actually tackle some of those problems in Latin America. One of them is offshore wind in connection with hydrogen. So countries like Brazil with 1,200 gigawatts of potential for technical offshore wind potential now presents a good opportunity for companies to have projects with hydrogen. In Brazil, there is already 50 plus projects of offshore wind pushing for environmental licensing. And with that being said, a lot of those projects are connection to hydrogen. We expect a big production of hydrogen to be exported to Australia, to places like Europe, to ease their demands, but also about roughly 90% of our fertilizers in Brazil, which is a very, very big agriculture country, it's imported. So we need to, with the Ukrainian war and some of the other geopolitical tensions, now we understand the hydrogen and the production of ammonia for also creation of fertilizers. So we see a very hopeful and, a different perspective on the energy transition, as we believe that also hydrogen can be utilized on transportations and other sources as well, to have a cleaner operations in country. In contrast, Brazil's energy mix, for example, or in Latin America, but specifically Brazil, we see a lot of renewables already connected to the grid. Roughly 80% of the energy mix in Brazil already comes from 51% hydropower, roughly 12 to 13% comes from solar, and 17% is coming from onshore wind. Therefore, we see a lot of opportunities, not just as a company, but in Brazil and other countries, to develop new energy projects. One thing that my fellow panelists also mentioned is the regulatory framework. There is a lot of uncertainties on new development of the regulatory framework. So it's important that when we're studying this energy transition, that we set the stage to collaboration between businesses and governments and society and communities to understand the needs of the energy needs, as well as how we can help the energy transition expand into Latin America.
Thank you. I think these were great kind of overview of what's going on. So I'm going to be asking a few questions to the panelists. The first one is for Matheus. I would like to know more, because you are in the industry here in the Gulf South that is providing services to renewable operations, renewable energy operations all over the world. I'd like to know, do you feel that the demand for these services are particularly growing? You mentioned the wind farms in Brazil, particularly growing in Latin America, and if so, what are the opportunities for companies in Louisiana and Texas and the U.S.?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. We do see a growth in demand of renewable energy, and it's based on fundamentally on the country goals to have renewable energy targets. You see countries like Brazil that want to have 36 gigawatts of both solar and wind by 2030, which is pretty vast, and we see that as an opportunity as a company. For example, GIS, we do have an onshore wind division where we fix blades, we do the maintenance, we do EPC as well, engineering, procurement, and construction of those renewables assets. And with the rising energy demand and the rise in commitments by governments and the security that it gives us, now we see that as a lot of opportunities in country to do that. We see markets like Chile as well growing in interest, as the panelists also mentioned. Chile is a big now renewable energy hub. They're developing we see a lot of the developers here in the U.S. expanding their operations into Chile and requesting our services in country, because there might not be readily available personnel or expertise in some of those countries, and new technologies as well that might not be developed in those countries due to the lack of incentive. And that now here with the RIA and some of the other incentives that we have, now we can go and develop those opportunities in country. So we see a lot of opportunities and a lot of ways to collaborate into Latin America and in leveraging a lot of the U.S. resources into country.
Thank you. A question for Francisco. When I was growing up in Brazil many decades ago, Brazil was an oil poor country. So a lot of the effort was on hydropower, building those big dams, and it became a big part of the energy grid there. Now, recently, in the last 10, 15 years, Brazil discovered this massive reserve of oil off the coast. The same thing happened in Guyana. Guyana is not technically a Latin American country, but it's right there because they speak English, right? It's not... but it's right there, north of Brazil. And they also discovered this massive reserve of oil that people are comparing to the whole thing that we have in the Middle East. Now, these recent discoveries and this wealth of oil now in some of parts of Brazil, in addition to the traditional Argentina, Mexico, Ecuador, Venezuela, would that delay the transition? How would that play out in the big picture of energy? I would like to.
Sure. I think, as you point out, it has been an amazing change in the region, in the oil industry. The offshore has become one of the most important areas of investment and increasing production. In fact, Latin America, for the first time in a long, long time, is increasing oil production in the last 3 years, and it's basically Brazil and Guyana. And in fact, Brazil and Guyana, along with the US and Canada, are the most important sources of growth, given that OPEC plus, it's cutting oil production. So this is a fascinating development. The only other place in the region in which I would say there is a significant excitement for the oil and gas investments is Argentina, but with all the obstacles of the macroeconomy and all the issues. But the reason why Argentina is pretty attractive is because the region of Vaca Muerta is the closest thing that you will find outside of the Permian Basin in the U.S. to a shale paradise. And so production could really increase there, but of course the obstacles are about the politics, etc. In terms of the energy transition, the interesting thing is that the barrels of Guyana and Brazil are among the lower carbon intensity per barrel production in the world, just comparable to the Middle East. So because these are high productivity per well fields, and in some cases, like in Brazil, they are using to re-inject the CO2, the natural gas, and it's carbon capture. So I think in that sense, Latin America should, as pragmatically President Lula is doing, develop its resources as much as they can. And I mean, the role to reduce oil consumption has to come from the demand side, and has to come from countries that tax, carbon and so I think it's not, Latin America is not sort of postponing the energy transition by supplying the oil that is demanded by the world, particularly because it's a lower carbon intensity type of oil.
Thank you. So, okay, I just want to ask one last question, then we open up to question for Ludovico. You mentioned the importance of government and sometimes social unrest around the big energy projects. You mentioned mining for critical minerals. Building a dam for hydropower is always a major effort, a lot of repercussions. I know you have experience, you have witnessed what happened in Costa Rica, and I'd like you to comment on that.
Certainly. Costa Rica, this little country that punches above its weight in the international sphere. Full disclosure, I'm from Costa Rica. It is a cautionary tale in many respects. It is highly regarded internationally because it is green in most senses. It has been able to generate 100% of its electricity from renewable sources, mostly hydroelectric and geothermal. But incidents in the past few years demonstrated that the hydro option, which gave Latin America its position today in terms of renewables, is perhaps exhausted. What you did, back in the 70s or in subsequent decades, displacing populations, perhaps taking over green spaces to create dams and flood large areas is increasingly difficult. The proliferation of dams itself has mobilized civil society in a way that has been very effective. Costa Rica was set to build the largest hydroelectric project in the entire Central American region, with a vision to export its excess energy to the rest of the Central American countries. And it was essentially stopped by social mobilization. The project had to be shuttered even after the National Electric Company had invested several $1 billion in preliminary work. Costa Rica is also a cautionary tale because it shows some of the limits of hydroelectric power. Right now, the country is facing the impacts of climate change that has reduced the level of water in its reservoirs. Increasingly there are dry spells, and rain is not what it used to be. So it is having now to rush to invest in fossil fuel generated electricity to make up for some of the deficiencies that it sees coming. Country's also been very successful in attracting foreign direct investment, and so is an exporter of industrial goods. In fact, Intel has 2 plants in Costa Rica and produces microchips there. So energy demand, electricity demand, is set to increase significantly. And the country is in a position where its green grid will no longer be able to sustain that level of growth. There's some geothermal power that it can tap, but those developments are expensive and they're slow. Wind and solar, of course, could complement the grid, but we are dealing with a country that considers electricity to be its national resource, and so there is a state monopoly that handles the generation and the distribution and transmission of electricity in the country. So even a successful example like Costa Rica shows that a diversified power grid is essential, and that a steady flow of investment in a dynamic environment as the one in which we live, add into the mix data banks for artificial intelligence or Bitcoin mining, and there you have also electrification, which is essential for the transition away from fossil fuels. Electricity demand is set to rise, and being prepared to face that increment is a tremendous challenge.
Thank you. I understand there are questions from the audience now that have
Yes,
been asked.
we have several questions. The first is, given the associated impacts of climate change, like variable rainfall, increased or extended droughts, how can the region balance these potential impacts on large-scale generation from sources like hydropower to ensure energy security? For example, investments in battery storage. And there was an additional question about water levels specifically in the Panama Canal.
You want to start, or? Sure. I think that as the region moves to solar and wind, its large hydro capacity itself can serve as a battery of sorts to regulate the electricity generated from those renewable variable sources.
But as you point out, the limits are that, and the question also poses the fact that this is being affected by climate change. So certainly this is one of the issues that we have seen, for example, in Texas, where we have seen a massive increase in solar and wind. You need, with these variable types of resources, you need another source or batteries to help you deal with those that variability. And I think that will probably mean in the region that natural gas will have to be part of the mix for a significant amount of time before battery technology gets to a point in which maybe that can be postponed. But as Ludovico said, the very fact that you have so much hydro is helpful for the introduction of the other two, because dams are in a way a big battery.
Another question?
Yes, our next question. You briefly mentioned the social and environmental aspects of renewable energy expansion in Latin America, which is often seen in conflicts between indigenous populations and the government. How can the renewable energy industry move forward in Latin America while also considering indigenous groups as stakeholders?
I think it's essential, and not only is it essential, it is a moral and legal obligation. Most of the countries in the region have subscribed international treaties that obligate them to the right for prior consultation that these populations have.
Another question?
What role, this is our final question for this morning, what role do you think carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets in Latin America will have in the decarbonization of Latin America as well as in other regions?
We talked about that before,
Yeah.
in the panel, right? So,
Wanna start, or?
You go ahead and I'll
Okay.
chime in.
Sure. So, I mean, the region has not advanced as much in this aspect. There are a few countries that have carbon taxes, but are very small and not particularly significant in terms of the impact in the evaluation of projects. You have a little bit of recently of development of some markets, and of course Latin America in the long run or in the next decade or so should play a big role, because it has the capacity of being a significant carbon sink and being a leader in these areas. So it is in the advantage of Latin America of doing all the regulatory work needed for that to work in the region, but also to tap into the markets of the rich countries of the world to take advantage of that. Without the development of deep markets for carbon, it would be very hard for Latin America to develop to finance its energy transition.
I would add to that as much as I am a believer in the importance of pricing carbon and agree with Francisco that it is essential, the main barriers to their effectiveness are political. Every year there are places that add one or other or another mechanism to price carbon around the world, either cap and trade or a carbon tax. But the number of those that put out a carbon price that is at the level that will be necessary to generate a counter incentive to the expansion of fossil fuels is very small. Mm-hmm. On average, they generate carbon prices that are far too reduced, and the reason is obvious. The political obstacles to pricing carbon are high because we are still a carbon-centric economy. Carbon is integral to everything we do, and people will feel it and will react to it.
I might add that, as I mentioned, the region actually is a major subsidizer of fossil fuels. Yeah. So not only we need to get rid of those, but we need to advance in taxing carbon.
The last time that they tried to raise prices in Venezuela, there was the Caracazo, no?
Yeah. So riots, and it has happened in Ecuador. It has happened elsewhere. That it's a very politically sensible issue. I mean, even in the U.S. it is. No, the U.S. hasn't approved a carbon tax for a variety of reasons, but lack of political will.
Even in Europe, France, the Yellow Jackets.
Exactly.
okay, I think time is up for us. I would summarize the panel as Latin America is on the right track to make progress with the renewals and the transition. We have to deal with the political, social, economic issues, investments, but it's a region where I believe we're making a lot of progress, and it can lead the world in many aspects. So I'd like to thank our panelists. So a big round of applause to them. We appreciate your participation and your questions, and continue to enjoy the forum. Thank you.